The message came through police radio at 6:47 a.m. on November 4th, 2024. Operation Whiskey Luxe is a go. All units move in. Across the Gold Coast, black vehicles pulled up to luxury homes in some of Queensland's most expensive neighborhoods. Inside these million-dollar properties, members and associates of Australia's most dangerous outlaw motorcycle gangs were about to have their worlds turned upside down. What police would discover over the next 4 days would shock even seasoned detectives. Weapons that could kill dozens, drugs worth hundreds of thousands on the street, and a criminal network that stretched from the glittering towers of Surfer's Paradise to the quiet suburbs of Hope Island. This is the story of how Queensland's elite Taskforce Maxima took down 15 suspected criminals in one of 2024's biggest bikie busts. But to understand why this operation was so important, we need to go back to where it all began. The birth of Australia's most feared police unit. 10 years before Operation Whiskey Luxe, Queensland had a problem. This is the story of how Queensland's elite Taskforce Maxima took down the Mongols. Fresh from their violent expansion in the United States, had established chapters on Australian soil. The rebels, already the largest bikie gang in the country, were recruiting heavily. The Comancheros were building their empire through drugs and violence. Traditional police methods weren't working. These weren't just guys who liked motorcycles. These were organized criminal enterprises with international connections, military-grade weapons, and millions of dollars in drug money. On September 30th, 2013, Queensland Police made a decision that would change everything. They created Taskforce Maxima, the first specialized outlaw motorcycle gang unit in Australia. The name itself was a message: maximum pressure, maximum disruption, maximum consequences. The numbers speak for themselves. In 10 years, Taskforce Maxima has made over 10,000 arrests. They have laid more than 31,000 charges. They've seized $18 million in cash and assets. They've taken 321 weapons off Queensland streets and destroyed $13.3 million worth of drugs. But November 2024 would prove to be one of their most successful operations yet. The target: a criminal web across Queensland. The intelligence started coming in months before Operation Whiskey Luxe launched. Phone intercepts, surveillance footage, financial records showing unexplained wealth, tips from the community. What emerged was a picture of a sophisticated criminal network operating across southeast Queensland. At its center were members and associates of 3 of Australia's most notorious outlaw motorcycle gangs: the Mongols, the Comancheros, and their associates. The Mongols had arrived in Australia just over a decade earlier, bringing with them a reputation for extreme violence that had terrorized California for 50 years. Founded in 1969 by Hispanic bikers who were rejected by the all-white Hells Angels, the Mongols had built their empire on methamphetamine, murder, and mayhem. Their Patch, a caricature of Genghis Khan wearing sunglasses and riding a motorcycle, had become a symbol of fear across 3 continents. In Australia, they were considered part of the Big 6 outlaw motorcycle gangs, alongside the Bandidos, Hells Angels, Comancheros, Finks, and Rebels. The Comancheros, meanwhile, were homegrown Australian criminals. Founded in the late 1960s, they had grown from a small Sydney club into a national organization with international reach. Their involvement in the infamous Milpera massacre in 1984 had shocked the nation and cemented their reputation as one of Australia's most dangerous gangs. But it wasn't just the gang members themselves that worried police. It was their associates, the network of suppliers, money launderers, and enablers who kept the criminal machine running. These were often people with no obvious connection to motorcycle clubs, operating out of legitimate businesses and respectable neighborhoods. The Gold Coast, Australia's crime capital. The Gold Coast had become ground zero for Australia's outlaw motorcycle gang wars. With its booming nightlife, international airport, and proximity to the New South Wales border, it was the perfect base for criminal operations. Surfer's Paradise, with its glittering high-rises and party atmosphere, provided the perfect cover for money laundering. Hope Island's exclusive marina was ideal for smuggling. The quiet suburbs of Talabujera and Coolmera offered secluded locations for drug labs and weapons storage. Police intelligence showed that gang members and associates had infiltrated every level of the Gold Coast's economy. They owned restaurants, ran security companies, and had connections in the construction industry. Some had invested their drug profits in legitimate businesses, creating a complex web of legal and illegal enterprises. The violence was escalating too. Drive-by shootings were becoming common. In one incident, a Mongols clubhouse was firebombed. Rival gang members were being shot in public places. Innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire. Queensland Police knew they had to act before the situation spiraled completely out of control. Operation Whiskey Luxe. The plan. Planning for operation. Whiskey Luxe began in August 2024. Detective teams from Taskforce Maxima worked alongside the organized crime gangs group and Gold Coast District Police to map out their targets. This wasn't just a Queensland operation. In a move that showed how serious the threat had become, police coordinated with New South Wales Police Force for a cross-border operation. The criminal networks didn't respect state boundaries, so neither would law enforcement. The operation would target multiple locations simultaneously. Police identified 10 addresses across the Gold Coast that they believed were central to the criminal network. These included properties in some of the area's most exclusive neighborhoods: Surfers Paradise, Talabujera, Coomera, Hope Island, and Wurrunggeri. The timing was crucial. Police needed to hit all locations at once to prevent suspects from warning each other or destroying evidence. They also needed enough manpower to properly search each property and process any arrests. November 4th was chosen as the start date. Over the next 4 days, teams of detectives would execute search warrants, interview suspects, and piece together the full extent of the criminal network. Day 1, the raids begin. At dawn on November 4th, 2024, Operation Whiskey Luxe began. Across the Gold Coast, police vehicles surrounded their targets. The raids were coordinated down to the minute. 6:47 a.m. was the go signal. The first location was a luxury apartment in Surfers Paradise. From the outside, it looked like any other high-end residence in one of Australia's premier tourist destinations. But when police forced entry, they discovered something far more sinister. Inside the apartment, officers found quantities of methamphetamine, the drug that had become the fuel of Australia's outlaw motorcycle gang economy. Crystal meth was easy to manufacture, highly addictive, and incredibly profitable. A kilogram of ice that cost a few $100s to produce could sell for $200,000 on the street. But the drugs were just the beginning. In a bedroom wardrobe, detectives discovered weapons that turned their blood cold. This wasn't just personal protection. These were instruments of war. At the same time, teams were hitting the other 9 locations. In Talabujera, a quiet suburb known for its family homes and proximity to excellent schools, police were uncovering evidence of a major drug trafficking operation. The house looked ordinary from the street: neat lawn, 2-car garage, probably worth over $1 million. But inside, officers found quantities of heroin, a drug that was making a deadly comeback in Australia's drug market. Heroin had devastated communities in the 1990s before the availability of ice pushed it into the background. But now it was returning, often mixed with fentanyl and other synthetic drugs that made it even more dangerous. The arsenal, weapons of war. As the searches continued across the 4-day operation, the scale of the weapons cache became clear. Police seized 3 firearms, including weapons that had no legitimate purpose except to kill. In Australia, firearms are strictly controlled. To legally own a gun requires licensing, registration, and regular inspections. But for criminal organizations, illegal weapons were essential tools of the trade. The firearms police found weren't hunting rifles or sporting guns. These were weapons designed for one purpose: to hurt other people. In the wrong hands, they could have been used for assassinations, armed robberies, or the kind of public shootouts that had plagued other cities where gang wars had spiraled out of control. But it wasn't just guns. Police also seized 2 tasers and OC spray, pepper spray designed to incapacitate victims. These weapons showed the level of preparation the criminals had undertaken. They weren't just planning to defend themselves, they were ready to attack. The discovery of these weapons sent a chill through the investigation team. Australia had largely avoided the kind of gang violence that plagued countries like Mexico or parts of the United States. But the arsenal police found in Operation Whiskey Luxe suggested that Queensland's criminal organizations were preparing for war. The drug factory, poison for profit. The drug seizures told the story of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Police found quantities of methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, MDMA, and prescription drugs. This wasn't small-time dealing, this was industrial-scale drug trafficking. Methamphetamine, commonly known as ice or crystal meth, was the gang's drug of choice. It was highly addictive, relatively easy to manufacture, and incredibly profitable. The drug had devastated communities across Australia, turning users into criminals and tearing families apart. But the gangs didn't care about the human cost. For them, ice was just a commodity, a way to generate the millions of dollars they needed to fund their lifestyles and expand their operations. The cocaine police found suggested international connections. Australia wasn't a major cocaine producer. The drug typically came from South America via complex smuggling networks. Finding cocaine in the raids indicated that the criminal organization had connections to international drug cartels. MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy, was popular in Australia's party scene. The Gold Coast nightclub industry made it a perfect market for the drug. Gang members often controlled security at nightclubs, giving them direct access to customers and the ability to eliminate competition. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of prescription drugs. These legitimate medications had been diverted from the legal supply chain and were being sold illegally. Prescription drug abuse had become a growing problem in Australia, with devastating consequences for users and their families. The money trail, following the cash. During the searches, police also seized $15,000 in cash. While this might not sound like a huge amount, experienced investigators knew it was just the tip of the iceberg. Criminal organizations like outlaw motorcycle gangs generate enormous amounts of cash through their illegal activities. But cash creates problems. It's hard to spend large amounts without attracting attention, and it's difficult to invest in legitimate businesses. The $15,000 police found was likely just operating capital, money kept on hand for immediate expenses like buying more drugs or paying bribes. The real wealth would be hidden in legitimate businesses, overseas accounts, or invested in assets like property and luxury cars. Taskforce Maxima had developed expertise in following money trails. Over their 10-year history, they had seized or restrained more than $18 million in cash and assets. They understood that hitting criminals in their wallets was often more effective than putting them in jail. Under Queensland's tough proceeds of crime laws, police could seize assets they believed were purchased with criminal profits. This meant that even if someone avoided conviction, they could still lose their house, car, or business if police could prove it was bought with drug money. The arrests, a network exposed. As the 4-day operation continued, the number of arrests mounted. By the time Operation Whiskey Luxe concluded, 15 people had been charged with 60 drug and firearm-related offenses. The suspects ranged in age from 29 to 58, showing that the criminal network spanned multiple generations. Some were patched members of outlaw motorcycle gangs, the elite inner circle who wore the gang's colors and participated in its decision-making. Others were associates, people who worked with the gangs but weren't formal members. Among those arrested was a 37-year-old man from Talabajara, who police allege was a Mongols associate. He was charged with trafficking dangerous drugs, one of the most serious offenses in Queensland's criminal code. Trafficking charges carried the possibility of decades in prison and showed that police believed he was at the center of the drug operation. A 35-year-old woman, also from Talabajara, was charged as a Comanchero associate. Her arrest showed that the criminal network wasn't just male-dominated. Women played important roles in outlaw motorcycle gang operations, often handling finances or providing logistical support. A 29-year-old man from Miami was charged with a fray and disturbing a place of religious worship. These charges suggested that the investigation had uncovered evidence of violence or intimidation, tactics commonly used by outlaw motorcycle gangs to control territory or eliminate rivals. The charges, justice served. The 60 charges laid during Operation Whiskey Luxe covered the full spectrum of serious criminal activity. Trafficking dangerous drugs was the most serious charge, carrying potential sentences of up to 25 years in prison. This charge was reserved for people police believed were at the heart of drug distribution networks. Possession charges were laid against people found with smaller quantities of drugs, likely for personal use or low-level dealing. But even these charges carried serious consequences. Queensland had some of the toughest drug laws in Australia. Weapons charges were particularly significant given Australia's strict gun laws. Unlawful possession of a firearm could result in years in prison, especially if the weapon was connected to criminal organizations. The range of charges showed the complexity of the criminal network police had uncovered. This wasn't just about drugs or just about weapons. It was about a sophisticated criminal enterprise involved in multiple types of illegal activity. The court appearances, facing justice. As the suspects were processed through Queensland's court system, the true scope of the operation became clear. Court appearances were scheduled at Southport Magistrates Court, the main court serving the Gold Coast region. For many of the suspects, these court appearances would be just the beginning of a long legal process. Serious charges like drug trafficking often took months or years to resolve, with preliminary hearings, committal proceedings, and eventually trials by jury. The court system was well equipped to handle these cases. Queensland had established specialized courts and prosecutors to deal with serious organized crime cases. These officials understood the complexities of gang-related prosecutions and the challenges of taking on well-funded criminal organizations. Some suspects would likely try to negotiate plea deals, trading information about their associates for reduced sentences. Others would fight the charges, forcing police to present their evidence in open court. The response? Police strike back. The success of Operation Whiskey Luxe sent shockwaves through Queensland's criminal underworld. For years, outlaw motorcycle gangs had operated with relative impunity, believing their codes of silence and intimidation tactics would protect them from law enforcement. But Taskforce Maxima had proven them wrong. The unit's 10-year track record showed that Queensland Police were committed to a long-term campaign against organized crime. They had the resources, the expertise, and the legal tools to take on even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. Detective inspector statements following the operation made the police position clear. Outlaw motorcycle gangs were not welcome in Queensland. The state had invested millions of dollars in giving law enforcement the tools they needed to fight organized crime, and they were prepared to use them. The cross-border cooperation with New South Wales Police also sent a message. Criminal organizations might not respect state boundaries, but law enforcement agencies were willing to work together to pursue them wherever they operated. The bigger picture. A war without end. Operation Whiskey Luxe was just one battle in a much larger war. Across Australia, outlaw motorcycle gangs continue to expand their operations, recruit new members, and develop new criminal enterprises. The Mongols, in particular, were seen as a growing threat. Their rapid expansion across Australia had been accompanied by increased violence and more sophisticated criminal operations. Police intelligence suggested they were actively recruiting from other gangs and trying to establish themselves as a major force in Australia's criminal underworld. The Comancheros, meanwhile, remained one of Australia's most powerful criminal organizations. With chapters across multiple states and international connections, they had proven resilient in the face of police pressure. The challenge for law enforcement was staying ahead of these organizations. Criminal groups were constantly evolving, using new technologies and developing new methods to avoid detection. They had access to millions of dollars in criminal profits and could afford the best lawyers and most sophisticated equipment. But Queensland Police had proven they were up to the challenge. Taskforce Maxima's success over 10 years showed that sustained pressure could disrupt even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. The impact. Lives saved, communities protected. The real success of Operation Whiskey Luxe couldn't be measured just in arrests or seizures. It was about the lives that would be saved by taking these drugs off the street. The methamphetamine seized in the operation would have destroyed countless families and communities if it had reached its intended market. Ice addiction was devastating Australian communities, turning users into criminals and tearing apart social networks. The weapons seizure was equally important. In the wrong hands, those firearms could have been used for assassinations, armed robberies, or public shootouts that endangered innocent civilians. The disruption of the criminal network would also have flow-on effects. With key players in custody or on bail with strict conditions, the organization would struggle to maintain its operations. Suppliers would be nervous, customers would look elsewhere, and rival groups might move in to fill the vacuum. The future, continuing the fight. Despite the success of Operation Whiskey Luxe, Queensland Police knew their work was far from over. Criminal organizations were adaptable and resilient. Those arrested would eventually be replaced, and new networks would emerge. The challenge was maintaining the pressure while adapting to new threats. Outlaw motorcycle gangs were increasingly using technology to coordinate their activities and avoid detection. They were also expanding into new criminal enterprises like cybercrime and money laundering. Taskforce Maxima would need to continue evolving to stay ahead of these threats. This meant investing in new technologies, training officers in new techniques, and building partnerships with other law enforcement agencies both in Australia and internationally. The legal framework would also need to continue developing. Queensland's tough anti-gang laws had been effective, but criminals were constantly looking for loopholes and new ways to operate outside the law. The message, crime doesn't pay. Operation Whiskey Luxe sent a clear message to anyone considering involvement with outlaw motorcycle gangs. Crime doesn't pay in Queensland. The state had some of the toughest anti-gang laws in Australia and was prepared to use them. The 15 people arrested in the operation faced the prospect of spending years in prison if convicted. They would also face the loss of their assets under proceeds of crime laws. For many, it would mean the end of their involvement with criminal organizations. But the message went beyond just those arrested. Every member and associate of outlaw motorcycle gangs in Queensland would have heard about Operation Whiskey Luxe. They would understand that police were watching, gathering evidence, and preparing to strike. The operation also sent a message to the community. Queensland Police were committed to protecting citizens from the threat posed by organized crime. They had the resources and expertise to take on even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. The techniques, how police fight back operation. Whiskey Luxe showcased the sophisticated techniques Queensland Police used to combat organized crime. The operation involved months of planning, intelligence gathering, and coordination between multiple agencies. Phone intercepts allowed police to monitor communications between gang members and associates. Financial intelligence helped them track money flows and identify criminal profits. Surveillance operations provided evidence of criminal meetings and activities. The coordinated raids demonstrated the importance of timing and surprise in law enforcement operations. By hitting multiple locations simultaneously, police prevented suspects from warning each other or destroying evidence. The cross-border cooperation with New South Wales Police showed how modern policing required collaboration between agencies. Criminal organizations operated across state boundaries, so law enforcement needed to do the same. The lessons, what we can learn. Operation Whiskey Luxe provided several important lessons about the nature of organized crime in modern Australia. First, it showed that outlaw motorcycle gangs had evolved far beyond their origins as motorcycle enthusiasts. They were now sophisticated criminal enterprises with international connections and multi-million-dollar operations. Second, it demonstrated that these organizations had infiltrated respectable communities and legitimate businesses. The raids in affluent suburbs like Hope Island and Surfers Paradise showed that criminal activity wasn't confined to traditional high-crime areas. Third, it highlighted the importance of community intelligence in fighting organized crime. Many of the leads that led to Operation Whiskey Luxe came from tips from concerned citizens who reported suspicious activity in their neighborhoods. Finally, it showed that sustained law enforcement pressure could be effective against even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. Taskforce Maxima's 10-year campaign had demonstrated that consistent, professional policing could disrupt criminal networks and protect communities. The conclusion: a victory for justice. As Operation Whiskey Luxe concluded in November 2024, Queensland Police could look back on another successful operation against organized crime. 15 suspected criminals were behind bars or facing serious charges. Dangerous drugs and weapons had been taken off the street. a sophisticated criminal network had been disrupted. But perhaps most importantly, the operation had sent a message that would resonate throughout Australia's criminal underworld. Queensland was not a safe haven for outlaw motorcycle gangs. The state had the laws, the resources, and the determination to take on organized crime wherever it emerged. The success of Operation Whiskey Luxe was built on 10 years of experience fighting outlaw motorcycle gangs. Taskforce Maxima had refined their techniques, built their intelligence networks, and developed the expertise needed to take on sophisticated criminal organizations. The men and women of Taskforce Maxima knew their work wasn't finished. There would be more operations, more arrests, and more disruptions of criminal networks. But Operation Whiskey Luxe had proven once again that in Queensland, crime doesn't pay. The 15 people arrested in Operation Whiskey Luxe now face the full weight of Queensland's justice system. For some, it would mean years in prison. For others, it might be a wake-up call that led them to abandon their criminal lifestyles. But one thing was certain: Queensland Police would continue their relentless campaign against organized crime. The safety of Queensland communities depended on it, and the men and women of Taskforce Maxima were determined not to let them down. The message from Operation Whiskey Luxe was clear and uncompromising. In Queensland, justice will prevail,